Chapter 15, Kingship on Earth. The deluge, a traumatic experience for mankind, was no less so for the, quote, gods, end quote, the Nephilim. In the words of the Sumerian king lists, quote, the deluge had swept over, end quote, and an effort of 120 shars was wiped away overnight. The South African mines, the cities in Mesopotamia, the control center at Nibiru, the spaceport at Separ, all lay buried under water and mud. Hovering in their shuttlecraft above devastated Earth, the Nephilim impatiently awaited the abatement of the waters so that they could set foot again on solid ground. How were they to survive henceforth on Earth when their cities and facilities were gone, and even their manpower, mankind, was totally destroyed? When the frightened, exhausted, and hungry groups of Nephilim finally landed on the peaks, quote, of Mount Salvation, end quote, they were clearly relieved to discover that man and beast alike had not perished completely. Even Enlil, at first enraged to discover that his aims had been partly frustrated, soon changed his mind. The deity's decision was a practical one. Faced with their own dire conditions, the Nephilim cast aside their inhibitions about man, rolled up their sleeves, and lost no time in imparting to man the arts of growing crops and cattle. Since survival, no doubt, depended on the speed with which agriculture and animal domestication could be developed to sustain the Nephilim and rapidly multiplying mankind, the Nephilim applied their advanced scientific knowledge to the task. Unaware of the information that could be culled from the biblical and Sumerian text, many scientists who have studied the origins of agriculture have arrived at the conclusion that its, quote, discovery, end quote, by mankind some 13,000 years ago was related to the neothermal, quote, newly warm, end quote, climate that followed the end of the last ice age. Long before modern scholars, however, the Bible also related the beginnings of agriculture to the aftermath of the deluge. Quote, sowing and harvesting, end quote, were described in Genesis as divine gifts granted to Noah and his offspring as part of the post-diluvial covenant between deity and mankind. For as long as the earth's days shall be, there shall not cease. Sowing and harvesting, cold and warm, summer and winter, day and night. Having been granted the knowledge of agriculture, quote, Noah as a husbandman was first, and he planted a vineyard, end quote. He became the first post-diluvial farmer engaged in the deliberate, complicated task of planting. The Sumerian texts, too, ascribe to the gods the granting to mankind of both agriculture and the domestication of animals. Tracing the beginnings of agriculture, modern scholars have found that it appeared first in the Near East, but not in the fertile and easily cultivated plains and valleys. Rather, agriculture began in the mountains skirting the low-lying plains in a semicircle. Why would farmers avoid the plains and limit their sowing and reaping to the more difficult mountainous terrain? The only plausible answer is that the low-lying lands were, at the time when agriculture began, uninhabitable. 13,000 years ago, the low-lying areas were not yet dry enough following the deluge. Millennia passed before the plains and valleys had dried sufficiently to permit the people to come down from the mountains surrounding Mesopotamia and to settle the low-lying plains. This, indeed, is what the book of Genesis tells us. Many generations after the deluge, people arriving, quote, from the east, end quote, from the mountainous areas east of Mesopotamia, quote, found a plain in the land of Shinar, Sumer, and settled there, end quote. The Sumerian texts state that Enlil first spread cereals, quote, in the hill country, end quote, in the mountains, not in the plains, and that he made cultivation possible in the mountains by keeping the floodwaters away. Quote, he barred the mountains as with a door, end quote. The name of the mountainous land east of Sumer, Elam, meant, quote, house where vegetation germinated, end quote. Later, two of Enlil's helpers, the gods Nanazu and Ninmada, extended the cultivation of cereals to the low-lying plains so that, eventually, quote, Sumer, the land that knew not grain, came to know grain, end quote. Scholars who have now established that agriculture began with the domestication of wild emmer as a source of wheat and barley are unable to explain how the earliest grains, like those found at the Shanidar cave, were already uniform and highly specialized. Thousands of generations of genetic selection are needed by nature to acquire even a modest degree of sophistication. Yet the period, time, or location in which such a gradual and very prolonged process might have taken place on Earth are nowhere to be found. There is no explanation for this botanegenetic miracle unless the process was not one of natural selection but of artificial manipulation. Spelt, a hard grain type of wheat, poses an even greater mystery. It is the product of, quote, an unusual mixture of botanic genes, end quote. Neither a development from one genetic source nor a mutation of one source. It is definitely the result of mixing the genes of several plants. The whole notion that man, in a few thousand years, changed animals through domestication is also questionable. Modern scholars have no answer to these puzzles, nor to the general question of why the mountainous semicircle in the ancient Near East became a continuous source of new varieties of cereals, plants, trees, fruits, vegetables, and domesticated animals. The Sumerians knew the answer. The seeds, they said, were a gift sent to Earth by Anu from his celestial abode. Wheat, barley, and hemp were lowered to Earth from the 12th planet. Agriculture and the domestication of animals were gifts given to mankind by Enlil and Enki, respectively. Not only the presence of the Nephilim, but also the periodic arrivals of the 12th planet in Earth's vicinity seem to lie behind the three crucial phases of man's post-diluvial civilization. Agriculture, circa 11,000 BC, the Neolithic culture, circa 7,500 BC, and the sudden civilization of 3,800 BC took place at intervals of 3,600 years. It appears that the Nephilim, passing knowledge to man in measured doses, did so in intervals matching the periodic returns of the 12th planet to Earth's vicinity. It was as though some on-site inspection, some face-to-face consultation, possibly only during the, quote, window, end quote, period that allowed landings and takeoffs between Earth and the 12th planet, had to take place among the, quote, gods, end quote, before another, quote, go-ahead, end quote, could be given. The, quote, Epic of Etana, end quote, provides a glimpse of the deliberations that took place. In the days that followed the deluge, it says, the great Anunnaki who decree the fate sat exchanging their counsels regarding the land. They who created the four regions, who set up the settlements, who oversaw the land, were too lofty for mankind. The Nephilim, we are told, reached the conclusion that they needed an intermediary between themselves and the masses of humans. They were, they decided, to be gods, Elu and Akkadian, meaning, quote, lofty ones, end quote. As a bridge between themselves as lords and mankind, they introduced, quote, kingship, end quote, on Earth, appointing a human ruler who would assure man's service to the gods and channel the teachings and laws of the gods to the people. A text dealing with the subject describes a situation before either tiara or crown had been placed on a human head, or scepter handed down. All these symbols of kingship, plus the shepherd's crook, the symbol of righteousness and justice, quote, lay deposited before Anu in heaven, end quote. After the gods had reached their decision, however, quote, kingship descended from heaven, end quote, to earth. Both Sumerian and Akkadian texts state that the Nephilim retained the, quote, lordship, end quote, over the lands, and had mankind first rebuild the pre-diluvial cities exactly where they had originally been, and as they had been planned. Quote, let the bricks of all the cities be laid on the dedicated places. Let all the bricks rest on holy places, end quote. Eridu, then, was first to be rebuilt. The Nephilim then helped the people plan and build the first royal city, and they blessed it. Quote, may the city be the nest, the place where mankind shall repose. May the king be a shepherd, end quote. The first royal city of man, the Sumerian texts tell us, was Kish. Quote, when kingship was lowered again from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, end quote. The Sumerian king lists, unfortunately, are mutilated just where the name of the very first human king was inscribed. We do know, however, that he started a long line of dynasties whose royal abode changed from Kish to Uruk, Awan, Hamazi, Aksak, Akkad, and then to Ashur and Babylon and more recent capitals. The biblical, quote, table of nations, end quote, likewise listed Nimrod, the patriarch of the kingdoms of Uruk, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, as descended from Kish. It records the spread of mankind, its land of kingships, as an outgrowth of the division of mankind into three branches following the deluge. Descended from and named after the three sons of Noah, these were the peoples and lands of Shem, who inhabited Mesopotamia and the Near Eastern lands, Ham, who inhabited Africa and parts of Arabia, and Japheth, the Indo-Europeans in Asia Minor, Iran, India, and Europe. These three broad groupings were undoubtedly three of the, quote, regions, end quote, whose settlement was discussed by the great Anunnaki. Each of the three was assigned to one of the leading deities. One of these was, of course, Sumer itself, the region of the Semitic peoples, the place where man's first great civilization arose. The other two also became sites of flourishing civilizations. Circa 3200 BC, about half a millennia after the blooming of the Sumerian civilization, statehood, kingship, and civilization made their first appearance in the Nile Valley, leading in time to the great civilization of Egypt. Nothing was known until some 50 years ago about the first major Indo-European civilization, but by now it is well established that an advanced civilization, encompassing large cities, a developed agriculture, a flourishing trade, existed in the Indus Valley in ancient times. It came into being, scholars believe, some 1,000 years after the Sumerian civilization began. Ancient texts as well as archaeological evidence attest to the close cultural and economic links between these two river valley civilizations and the older Sumerian one. Moreover, both direct and circumstantial evidence has convinced most scholars that the civilizations of the Nile and Indus not only were linked to, but were actually offspring of, the earlier civilization of Mesopotamia. The most imposing monuments of Egypt, the pyramids, have been found to be, under a stone, quote, skin, end quote, simulations of the Mesopotamian ziggurats, and there is reason to believe that the ingenious architect who designed the plans for the Great Pyramids and supervised their construction was a Sumerian venerated as a god. The ancient Egyptian name for their land was the, quote, raised land, end quote, and their prehistoric memory was that, quote, a very great god who came forth in the earliest times, end quote, found their land lying under water and mud. He undertook great works of reclamation, literally raising Egypt from under the waters. The, quote, legend, end quote, neatly describes the low-lying valley of the Nile River in the aftermath of the deluge. This olden god, it can be shown, was none other than Enki, the chief engineer of the Nephilim. Though relatively little is known as yet regarding the Indus Valley civilization, we do know that they, too, venerated the number 12 as a supreme divine number, that they depicted their gods as human-looking beings wearing horned headdresses, and that they revered the symbol of the cross, the sign of the 12th planet. If these two civilizations were of Sumerian origin, why are their written languages different? The scientific answer is that the languages are not different. This was recognized as early as 1852, when the Reverend Charles Foster of the One Primeval Language ably demonstrated that all the ancient languages then deciphered, including early Chinese and other Far Eastern languages, stemmed from one primeval source, thereafter shown to be Sumerian. Similar pictographs had not only similar meanings, which could be a logical coincidence, but also the same multiple meanings and even the same phonetic sounds, which suggests a common origin. More recently, scholars have shown that the very first Egyptian inscriptions employed a language that was indicative of a prior written development. The only place where a written language had a prior development was Sumer. So we have a single written language that for some reason was differentiated into three tongues: Mesopotamian, Egyptian/Hamitic, and Indo-European. Such a differentiation could have occurred by itself over time, distance, and geographical separation. Yet the Sumerian texts claim that it occurred as a result of a deliberate decision of the gods, once again initiated by Enlil. Sumerian stories on the subject are paralleled by the well-known biblical story of the Tower of Babel, in which we are told, quote, that the whole earth was of one language and of the same words, end quote. But after the people settled in Sumer, learned the art of brick-making, built cities, and raised high towers, ziggurats, they planned to make for themselves a shem and a tower to launch it. Therefore, quote, did the Lord mingle the earth's tongue, end quote. The deliberate raising of Egypt from under the muddy waters, the linguistic evidence, and the Sumerian and biblical texts support our conclusion that the two satellite civilizations did not develop by chance. On the contrary, they were planned and brought about by the deliberate decision of the Nephilim. Fearing, evidently, a human race unified in culture and purpose, the Nephilim adopted the imperial policy, quote, divide and rule, end quote. For while mankind reached cultural levels that included even airborne efforts, after which, quote, anything they shall scheme to do shall no longer be impossible for them, end quote, the Nephilim themselves were a declining lot. By the 3rd millennium BC, children and grandchildren, to say nothing of humans of divine parentage, were crowding the great olden gods. The bitter rivalry between Enlil and Enki was inherited by their principal sons, and fierce struggles for supremacy ensued. Even the sons of Enlil, as we have seen in earlier chapters, fought among themselves, as did the sons of Enki. As has happened in recorded human history, overlords tried to keep the peace among their children by dividing the land among their heirs. In at least one known instance, one son, Ishkur/Adad, was deliberately sent away by Enlil to be the leading local deity in the mountain land. As time went on, the gods became overlords, each jealously guarding the territory, industry, or profession over which he had been given dominion. Human kings were the intermediaries between the gods and the growing and spreading of humanity. The claims of ancient kings that they went to war, conquered new lands, or subjugated distant peoples, quote, on the command of my God, end quote, should not be taken lightly. Text after text makes it clear that this was literally so. The gods retained the powers of conducting foreign affairs, for these affairs involved other gods and other territories. Accordingly, they had the final say in matters of war or peace. With the proliferation of people, states, cities, and villages, it became necessary to find ways to remind the people of who their particular overlord, or quote, lofty one, end quote, was. The Old Testament echoes the problem of having people adhere to their God and not, quote, prostitute after other gods, end quote. The solution was to establish many places of worship and to put up in each of them the symbols and likenesses of, quote, correct, end quote, gods. The age of paganism began. Following the deluge, the Sumerian texts inform us, the Nephilim held lengthy councils regarding the future of gods and man on earth. As a result of these deliberations, they, quote, created the 4 regions, end quote. 3 of them, Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, and the Indus Valley, were settled by man. The 4th region was, quote, holy, end quote, a term whose original literal meaning was, quote, dedicated, restricted, end quote. Dedicated to the gods alone, it was a, quote, pure land, end quote, an area that could be approached only with authorization. Trespassing could lead to quick death by, quote, awesome weapons, end quote, wielded by fierce guards. This land or region was named Tilman, literally, quote, the place of the missiles, end quote. It was the restricted area where the Nephilim had reestablished their space base after the one at Sippar had been wiped out by the deluge. Once again, the area was put under the command of Utu/Shamash, the god in charge of the fiery rockets. Ancient heroes like Gilgamesh strove to reach this land of living, to be carried by a Shem, or an eagle, to the heavenly abode of the gods. We recall the plea of Gilgamesh to Shamash. Let me enter the land, let me raise my Shem. By the life of my goddess mother who bore me, of the pure faithful king, my father, my step direct to the land. Ancient tales, even recorded history, recall the ceaseless efforts of men to, quote, reach the land, end quote, find the, quote, plant of life, end quote, gain eternal bliss among the gods of heaven and earth. This yearning is central to all the religions whose roots lie deep in Sumer, the hope that justice and righteousness pursued on earth will be followed by, end quote, afterlife, end quote, in some heavenly divine abode. But where was this elusive land of the divine connection? The question can be answered. The clues are there, but beyond it loom other questions. Have the Nephilim been encountered since? What will happen when they are encountered again? And if the Nephilim were the, quote, gods, end quote, who, quote, created, end quote, man on earth, Did evolution alone on the 12th planet create the Nephilim? End of chapter 15 and the book The 12th Planet by Zecharia Sitchin. Thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe for more. And if you enjoyed this book and want to hear the next book in the Earth Chronicles series titled The Stairway to Heaven, please comment sequel below. Have a wonderful day.